Well, as the US is raising the number of troops in Afghanistan, Thursday will mark 30 years since the launch of the USSR's campaign in the country. So how valuable is Russia's experience for the ongoing conflict? Well, let's cross to RT Studio in Washington, D.C. for more on this, where Lauren Lister is on the case for us. Lauren.
Alice, I'm joined by a guest who may be able to tell us. Marc Sageman was there in Afghanistan in the 80s. He's a former CIA officer. He was one of the officers in charge of the Afghanistan effort by the U.S. to covertly back the Mujahideen freedom fighters against the Soviet Union. Now, Mr. Sageman, some of those freedom fighters in the 80s, aren't they today's Taliban that the U.S. is fighting?
Very few. Most of them are not.
Well, the U.S., I mean, essentially, it's been said that the U.S. is fighting the same war twice in one generation, but on opposite sides. Who was right? Who's right?
Well, this is Afghanistan. People have a tendency to flip-flop and to fight their allies and then their enemies. Basically, what they're doing, that they're against their own government, and whoever supports their government is the enemy.
Okay, well, now Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, he was quoted in an article pointing out the irony about how 25 years ago he was shoving arms across the border for the Mujahideen commander Gulbuddin Hekmatyar to fight the Soviet Union against in the 80s, to fight the Soviets. And now that same commander is fighting U.S. allies in the U.S. in northern Afghanistan. How do you explain that irony?
Well, that's partially true. We gave the weapons to the Pakistanis who distributed them. The Pakistanis definitely had favorites. One of them was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. He was not one of our favorites. As a matter of fact, my role in Afghanistan was to even out the playing field so that I was supporting Massoud and Jamiat Islamiyah against the Hizb Islami of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. It was really almost against Hekmatyar that my program was. So it's not unusual, let's say, given the various contingencies of the Afghan situation, to see people flip-flop and to support one side and then another and then back to the first side. It's not so much our policy, it's really Afghanistan itself.
But in supporting those people then, in essence, you're supporting the effort against the U.S. now. Didn't it set the stages for the conflict today?
No, not really. This is quite a crooked road. The reason we're in Afghanistan was because Al-Qaeda took refuge in Afghanistan. Had they stayed in the Sudan, we'd be speaking about the Sudan right now and not Afghanistan. So you can't really just make a straight line and kind of skip over 15 years of history.
But if the U.S. had not backed those freedom fighters then, maybe the Taliban wouldn't be as powerful now, or the people fighting against the U.S. effort wouldn't have as much power now.
No, the Taliban was really a Pakistani creation, and the Taliban was against Hekmatyar. The Taliban was against a lot of our former allies who fought the Soviet Union. Many of them, we still relied on them to overthrow the Taliban in 2001. So again, I would caution you from skipping a large part of history.
But when you look over 30 years later, after all is said and done, did the U.S. do the wrong thing in Afghanistan 30 years ago?
No, because Afghanistan was of no importance then, just as it's of no importance right now. The important fighter at that time was the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union basically died partially because of Afghanistan, and that makes a world much safer right now.
But now Afghanistan, all the focus, or much of the focus, has been turned there, and that's seen as a major problem for the U.S. and its allies. So, I mean, it's not a linear line, as you're saying, but now that's the enemy.
I'm not sure that's enemy. Some people in Afghanistan may be the enemy, but our real enemy are not in Afghanistan. It's Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda is not in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is in Pakistan. There are no Afghan in Al-Qaeda, and there's no Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan.
But the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are supportive of each other.
Not quite.
The Taliban harbors Al-Qaeda.
No, that's not true. It did between 1996 and 2001. It no longer is true. Al-Qaeda is now hiding in the federally administered tribal area, the Fatah. Some of them are allies with various factions of the Taliban. The Taliban is not unified. There's a Pakistani Taliban, there's an Afghan Taliban, and the Taliban is a plural name so that some people are pro-Al-Qaeda, some people are against Al-Qaeda. It's a very complicated situation, and it's not made easier by lumping everybody together and confusing the issue.
Okay, so then 30 years later, is there anything that the U.S. can learn about the Soviet defeat in Afghanistan?
Oh, yes.
In the 80s?
Oh, yes. We basically should get out of there very quickly.
Get out of there very quickly?
Yes.
Final word. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Back to you in Moscow.
Okay, Lauren, many thanks to you. And